Welcome back for another deep dive. I'm so excited for today's episode because we're going to be talking about Jean Bodin as a philosopher. I'm sure you've heard of him, right? You know, the sovereignty guy.
Of course, everyone in political philosophy knows Boudin.
Yeah.
The most high, absolute, and perpetual power and all that, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what's interesting is that Bodin was so much more than just that one concept. He was really a true Renaissance man. He was a lawyer, an economist, a historian even, and get this, even wrote about witchcraft.
Wild, right?
Oh, yeah. Bodin was deeply immersed in all sorts of fields, really delved into a whole spectrum of knowledge. It was actually pretty common for intellectuals in his time to do that.
So true. The Renaissance was all about that kind of intellectual exploration, wasn't it?
It really was. But with Bodin, what's really fascinating is how all those different experiences he had, all those different fields he was into, actually seem to have shaped his political and philosophical ideas. Okay, so today, we're going beyond, like, the textbook definition of sovereignty, going beyond the Bodin equals absolute power soundbite. We're going deep, really trying to understand the nuances of his thinking.
Right, exactly. And honestly, it's going to be a really exciting journey.
I'm ready. Let's dive in. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think we should start with, well, we've got to address the elephant in the room, right? That word absolute in his famous definition of sovereignty.
It does kind of jump out at you, doesn't it?
It really does. The most high, absolute, and perpetual power over the citizens and subjects in a commonwealth. Like, wow. As a philosopher, I'm sure those words probably set off some alarm bells for you, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially absolute. It conjures up images of, like, dictators and tyrants, which doesn't really sit well with, my personal philosophy.
And that's exactly why understanding the historical context is so important, especially for a philosopher like you. It's so easy to just read these old texts with our modern lenses and miss the nuances.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like if we try to analyze, like, Plato's Republic through the lens of 21st century democracy, we'd miss so much.
Exactly. So going back to Bodin, when he used the word absolute, he was working within a very specific framework, a framework that was grounded in natural and divine law.
Okay, so you're saying there are limits to this absolute power.
Yes, 100%. For Boudin, sovereign is absolute in the sense of not being bound by what he called civil laws, meaning the laws that humans create.
Well, I'm following.
And this is key, the sovereign was always subject to natural law, which is like the inherent order of the universe, and also to divine law, the law of God.
Okay, so there are higher laws that even the sovereign has to answer to.
Exactly. And this is crucial because it challenges this big misconception that a lot of people have about Bodin. They read absolute, and they immediately assume he's advocating for some kind of like tyrannical, unchecked power.
So he's not advocating for the same kind of absolutism that we saw with, say, Louis XIV, who famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state."
No, not at all. I mean, Boudin even distinguished between different types of monarchies. He talked about, like, despotic monarchies, tyrannical ones, and those he saw as totally illegitimate.
So his theory of sovereignty was actually a lot more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
It was incredibly nuanced. He was really trying to figure out, like, what's the legitimate scope of the sovereign's power? But he was always grounding that within a framework of higher laws. It's like, as a philosopher, you know that words can change meaning over time, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so dangerous to, like, judge historical thinkers based on today's standards without understanding the historical context. It's like, that whole danger of presentism that we always talk about.
Exactly. And that trap is one that people often fall into when they read Boudin. They get stuck on absolute and jump to all the wrong conclusions.
Right.
But if you really dig into his work, you see that he was actually very, very concerned with limiting the power of the sovereign, He was trying to find that balance between the need for order and the need for justice.
You know what? This is already making me rethink my entire understanding of Boudin.
That's what's so cool about these deep dives. We get to peel back the layers and really wrestle with these, like, really complex ideas.
It's so easy to just get caught up in the sound bites and the oversimplifications.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, but speaking of complexities, let's talk about Boudin and the politiques. He's often lumped in with this group of thinkers who were advocating for religious tolerance during the French Wars of Religion. So, like, was he truly one of them? That's the million-dollar question. It's actually something that scholars are still debating today. I mean, Boudin did argue for a certain degree of religious coexistence, but he saw it more as, like, a temporary measure.
So, like, a means to an end.
Exactly. He saw it as a step on the path towards religious reunification, not necessarily an end goal in itself.
So while he recognized the need for some level of tolerance, like in practice, he was still ultimately hoping for a world where everyone was back in the Catholic Church.
Well, it's not quite that simple. I mean, he was a lifelong Catholic, but he was also, like, pretty critical of the church. He even had some, anti-papal sentiments.
Yeah.
We have to remember that a lot of humanist thinkers at that time were pushing for reforms within the Catholic Church.
Right. So even back then, people were having trouble, like, putting him in a neat little box, religiously speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. A contemporary of his even called him and get this, a politique and a dangerous Catholic. So, yeah, even back then, people didn't quite know what to make of his religious beliefs. And then, of course, you have the Heptaplomeres, the Colloquium of the Seven about secrets of the sublime. Talk about intrigue.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that. That sounds like a Dan Brown novel or something.
Right. It gets really interesting. First off, it was published after he died, and scholars still debate whether he even actually wrote it.
Ooh, even more intrigue. So what is it about?
Okay, so it's structured as this dialogue. Imagine, like, Plato's dialogues, but with a 16th century spin. There are 7 speakers, each representing a different religion or philosophy, and they have all these discussions about the nature of faith, and get this, the possibility of religious coexistence.
So is he, like, laying out his ideal model for religious tolerance in this book? Is that what he's doing?
It's way more complicated than that. What's fascinating is that these speakers, they all end up agreeing on the freedom of conscience, like the right to believe what you want, you
Yeah.
know? But, and here's the twist, they disagree on the freedom of worship, like the right to actually practice your religion publicly. It's a subtle difference, but huge in the 16th century.
Yeah.
What do you think about that distinction as a philosopher?
That's a really fascinating distinction. I mean, it really speaks to the complexity of his thought, right? I mean, this is the guy who was clearly wrestling with all of these ideas. Like,
Yeah.
the world around him was literally being torn apart by religious conflict. He was trying to find a way forward, you know?
Absolutely. And that's like a big part of what makes Bodin so brilliant. He wasn't just a theorist, just coming up with ideas in a vacuum. He was a pragmatist, too. He was trying to find practical solutions for real-world problems. That's something you can appreciate as a philosopher, right? Philosophy isn't just about these abstract ideas. It's about understanding and improving the world we live in, right?
You know what? I completely agree. It's so interesting to see how he was trying to bridge that gap between theory and practice.
And you see that bridge, that pragmatic side, not just in his ideas about religion and politics, but in his work on economics, too.
He was also really interested in, like, the economic trends of his day, right?
You're totally right. Bodin wasn't just focused on, like, political and religious theory. He was also a real pioneer when it came to economics.
I have to admit, I don't actually know that much about Bodin's economic theories. What were some of his main ideas?
Well, one of his biggest contributions, for sure, was his theory of inflation.
Inflation, huh? Okay, I'm listening.
So he basically challenged all the conventional wisdom of the time. He argued that, people thought that inflation was caused by debasing the currency. But Boudin said, no, it's actually because of the abundance of gold and silver.
That's interesting. He was writing at a time when Europe was experiencing massive inflation because of all that gold and silver coming in from the New World, right?
Exactly. The Spanish conquistadors are hauling in all this treasure, and it's having this huge impact on the European economy. And Bodin was one of the first to actually recognize the connection between that increase in the money supply and the fact that prices were going way up.
So he was basically saying that having too much gold and silver could actually be a bad thing for the economy.
Yeah, exactly. He was saying that it was disrupting, like, the whole economic balance, driving up prices, making it harder for everyday people to afford, the things they needed.
That sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? I mean, we're still dealing with inflation today, though it's probably more complicated than just having too much gold lying around.
Right. History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And you know what? Back in Bodin's day, there were these big debates about how to actually deal with inflation. Some people thought, okay, let's try price controls. Others were like, no, we need to debase the currency, make the coins less valuable. But Bodin, and this might surprise you, advocated for free trade.
Wait, really? He was for letting the market determine the value of money?
Yeah.
That's like, what, centuries before Adam Smith?
Yeah, pretty much. His ideas about inflation, and especially his ideas about the role of the market, make him, in a lot of ways, a really early advocate for those free market principles. It's pretty fascinating, right?
It is fascinating, especially as a philosopher. It really gets me thinking about those big questions of value and justice,
Yeah.
Like if all that wealth, all that gold and silver was actually harming the common good, that's got some serious ethical implications.
I totally agree. And, it's clear that Bodin wasn't just interested in describing how the economy worked. He was also thinking about the moral and social implications of economic policies.
It seems like Bodien was always challenging the status quo, right? In politics, religion, and even economics, he was a real intellectual trailblazer.
Oh, absolutely. He was a true original. And honestly, maybe the best example of that independent spirit, that willingness to challenge assumptions, is his work on witchcraft.
Yeah, his treatise
Yeah.
on the demon mania of witches, I've always been kind of intrigued by that. But, it's always been a little perplexing to me, too. Like, how could someone like Bodin, so brilliant, so ahead of his time in so many ways, also believe in something like witchcraft?
That's a great question. And I think it really speaks to, how complex the intellectual world was back in the 16th century. We have to remember that back then, a belief in witchcraft was widespread. It wasn't just like the uneducated masses. Even some of the most educated and enlightened people, they believed in it too.
So it wasn't just like superstition or ignorance.
No, not at all. I mean, Bodin truly believed that witchcraft was a real danger. He saw it as like a threat to society. He believed that witches had made pacts with the devil and they could use their supernatural powers to harm people. And it wasn't just theoretical for him either. It had real-world implications.
You're talking about the part where he recommends the death penalty for people found guilty of sorcery?
Yeah. In his treatise, he lays out this very detailed, almost legal framework for how to identify, prosecute, and punish witches. He even advocates for some pretty harsh punishments, including, the death penalty.
That seems so different from his like nuanced views on sovereignty and religious tolerance. That's kind of a jarring contrast, don't you think?
It really is. And it's something that, historians and philosophers, they've been wrestling with for centuries. How could this man, this champion of the rule of law, this guy who advocated for religious coexistence, how could he be so ruthless when it came to dealing with people accused of witchcraft? It's a tough question.
I guess it just goes to show like how powerful the fear of the supernatural was back then.
Absolutely. I mean, the 16th century was a crazy time. So much upheaval, so much uncertainty. The Reformation, the wars, the plagues. People were scared. They were looking for explanations. They wanted to make sense of all the suffering and misfortune around them.
And it's easier to blame like a scapegoat, right? To point the finger at witches and demons instead of facing the complexities of the real world.
Exactly. And Bodin, with his sharp intellect and his legal background, he was able to kind of systematize those fears. He turned them into a really coherent and persuasive argument for persecuting witches.
It's a good reminder that even brilliant minds can be influenced by the prevailing beliefs and prejudices of their time.
It really is. And, for Bodin, this fear of witchcraft, it wasn't just theoretical. It got very personal for
Oh,
him.
you're talking about the time when his own house was searched for evidence of witchcraft. Now, that's a story I've been dying to hear more about.
It's a pretty wild story. So picture this. It's 1587. The prosecutor in Paris orders a search of Bodin's house.
Wait, really? His own house?
I know, right? The irony. The man who literally wrote the book on how to identify and punish witches is now a suspect.
That's crazy. So what happened? Did someone actually accuse him of being a witch?
Well, it seems like there were some rumors going around about Bodin. People were saying he was involved in some, occult practices. And this prosecutor, maybe he was looking to make a name for himself or something, he decided to take action.
So they went barging into his house, looking for bubbling cauldrons and broomsticks.
I don't think they found any of that, thankfully. But I can't imagine how humiliating, how unsettling it must have been for Bodin. I mean, can you imagine being accused of the very crime you've dedicated yourself to exposing?
That would be pretty rough. What happened after the search? Was he, like, cleared of any wrongdoing?
Luckily for Bodin, he had some powerful friends, some prominent citizens, and even a couple of priests vouched for his character. So the case was eventually dropped. But, I mean, it definitely left a stain on his reputation.
Reputation was everything back then, too, just like it is now.
It totally was. And, this whole incident, it really highlights how dangerous those witch hunts were. I mean, they were sweeping across Europe. And even someone like Bodo, this respected scholar, this legal expert, even he could become a target. It's kind of chilling when you think about it.
It is pretty disturbing. And this all happened during that really turbulent time in France, right?
Yeah.
With all the religious and political turmoil.
Exactly. The French wars of religion were raging, and the Catholic League had emerged as this major force. They were basically challenging the authority of the monarchy.
And this is where things get even more interesting with Bodo. Because even though he wrote all about the absolute power of the sovereign, he actually ended up joining the Catholic League.
Yeah, I know, right? His decision to join the League, it's baffled historians for ages. Why would this guy, who had dedicated so much of his work to defending the concept of sovereignty, why would he side with a group that was basically rebelling against the king?
It does seem kind of contradictory.
It definitely does. But if you want to understand what he did, you really have to consider the political situation at the time. I mean, think about it. France was in chaos. The wars of religion were tearing the country apart. And here's the League, this group that was staunchly Catholic, and they were promising to restore order. And you know what? That probably appealed to Bodo. He craved order, and he wanted religious unity too.
So you're saying he was putting those things, his religious beliefs and his desire for stability, he was putting those things above his loyalty to the monarchy?
That seems to be the case. And you can imagine how tough that decision must have been for him.
Yeah, I mean, when everything around you is falling apart, it's got to be hard to know what to do, who to trust.
Absolutely. And to understand his decision better, there's a key document we should look at. He wrote a letter in 1590 where he explains his reasons for joining the League.
Oh, wow. So we have, like, a first-hand account of his thinking. I would love to know what he had to say. What were his main arguments?
Okay, so first off, he mentions the Edict of Union from 1588. Basically, it forced all French subjects to join a league. And if you refused, you could be accused of treason.
Wow. So there was a lot of pressure on him to join.
Definitely. But he also expresses some real fears about what was happening. He was worried about his city, Laon. He thought a Huguenot regiment was going to attack and loot it.
Given the violence of the times, that's a totally understandable concern. It sounds like he was trying to protect his community.
And himself, too. There had been assassination attempts against him. So he wasn't just worried about abstract political theory at this point. He was worried about his life.
So basically, it sounds like a combination of things, like the legal pressure, the fear for his city, and fear for his own safety. All of those things kind of pushed him towards the League.
Right. But even in his letter, Bodin doesn't just blindly follow the League's line. He actually offers this really insightful analysis of the whole political situation. He talks about the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. He even criticizes the League's leadership.
So it seems like he was always thinking for himself, even when he was making, really difficult and probably unpopular choices.
Absolutely. He was a true independent thinker. And honestly, that's part of what makes Boudin such a fascinating figure. He was full of contradictions. He was this brilliant mind, but he could also embrace ideas that seemed completely incompatible.
He was definitely a man of his time, but he was also ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
It's amazing how Baudin's life, his work, it all reflects just how turbulent the 16th century was.
Yeah.
But what really strikes me is that his ideas, the ones he came up with in that time of chaos, they still resonate with us even today.
I think what's so fascinating about Boudin is that he wasn't just reacting to what was happening around him. He was also a very serious student of history.
Oh yeah, he was really into history, wasn't he?
He was. And he saw history not as this straight line, always progressing, but as a cycle. Like things rise and fall. He thought political systems were like that too. They go through these cycles.
That's a perspective that makes a lot of sense to me as a philosopher. I mean, we're always looking for those patterns, right? Those timeless truths that go beyond just the specific details of any one time period.
Exactly. And Bodin, because he had such a deep understanding of the past, he was able to see those patterns. And then he connected them to the problems of his own time. Think about his concept of sovereignty, for instance. We are still debating that today, especially now, with globalization challenging the old ideas of national borders and state power.
It really makes you wonder what Boudin would have to say about, the state of democracy today. With all the stuff we're dealing with,
That's a really good question. I mean, he didn't trust mob rule, but he also didn't trust unchecked tyranny. He knew how fragile political systems can be. So given his view that history moves in cycles, I wonder, what kind of advice would he give to us, to those of us who are trying to protect our democratic institutions?
That is something I'm going to be thinking about for sure.
Right.
It's so cool how this deep dive into Baudin's world, it's not just given us a glimpse of the past. It's also given us some really useful tools to think about what's going on right now.
You got it. And I think exploring thinkers like Bodin, it helps us grapple with those big, timeless questions that humans have always struggled with. Questions about power, justice, freedom, the good life.
And those questions, they don't go away, do they?
Nope, not at all. They're just as important today as they were back in the 16th century. Maybe even more so.
Well, I've got to say, I have a whole new appreciation for Jean Bodin. He wasn't just the sovereignty guy, like I thought. He was a much more complex thinker, and he was engaged with so many issues that we're still dealing with today.
I'm so glad to hear that. I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to, go back and read some of his work. There's so much to discover in his writing.
I think I'm going to dust off my copy of Six Books of the Commonwealth tonight. Thanks for joining me on this awesome intellectual journey.
The pleasure was all mine. And until next time, keep thinking. Keep those philosophical wheels turning.